So good evening, everybody. We are here to discuss or to present our book, After Auschwitz, The Difficult Legacy of the GDR. And I may introduce myself. My name is Anetta Kahane. I'm a member of the Amadeu Antonio Foundation, and I would like to introduce to you the panelists, the people who participated in making the book. This is Martin Jander. He is an historian, and he is doing civic education, lecturing in different universities and American campuses in Berlin. Enrico Heitzer, he is working at the Memorial in Sachsenhausen. He is a researcher and an historian as well. And Patrice Poutrus, he is also an historian, and he is working at the university in Erfurt in modern and contemporary history. And last but not least, Ms. Eckert, I'm very happy to have you here tonight. She will guide us. She will present the book, and she will guide us through the evening. And Astrid Eckert is an American-German historian, and she is working at the Emory University in Atlanta, also in modern history, and she wrote a lot of books. And now I lost the special paper where I can say she graduated in. Oh my God! I cannot find it. She graduated in the United States at the Michigan University, and she is then she graduated later in European history at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and since 2003 she is a doctor of modern history at the Freie Universität Berlin, and now she is professor for modern European history at the Emory University in Atlanta. She published a lot of essays and books, and I'm very happy to have her tonight to present our book. And yeah, I think we should start now. Astrid.
Me?
No, excuse me.
I think it's Dr. Heitzer.
It is Enrico.
Yeah, just a short welcome. On behalf of the Sachsenhausen Memorial, I also would like to welcome all participants to this discussion, Anetta Kahane, Patrice Poutrus and Martin Jander, but also especially Professor Eckert, who will be moderating this book presentation. I look forward to the discussions here, and I think that everybody knows who Anetta Kahane is, right? She's the executive director of the Amadeu Antonio Foundation in Germany, and which is hosting this video stream. Thank you.
I used to be. I'm retired now. Yeah.
Okay, well, then I take over. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion of your new book, After Auschwitz, The Difficult Legacies of the GDR, published with Berghahn Publishers last year. Let me just hold it up here briefly. The book is a translation of a German version that came out already in 2018. After Auschwitz revisits the anti-fascist rationale of the GDR and looks at the consequences of the prescribed engagement with the Nazi past, the consequences for the life in the GDR, and for our present moment. Our present moment has, of course, shifted significantly since you have published this book. For the record, today is day 70 of Russia's attack against sovereign Ukraine, an attack that is justified with sound bites from the arsenal of post-war anti-fascism. My name is Astrid M. Eckert. I will be leading us through the conversation tonight. Welcome to everybody who is live with us on the screen or who watches the recording of this meeting at a later date. For those of you who are here in real time, you are invited to put your questions and comments into the chat whenever they occur to you, and I will do my best to feed them into the conversation as far as I manage the multitasking. The contributors or the four editors of the volume have just been introduced by Anetta Kahane, so I can skip that part and transition us directly into our conversation. And I would first ask Enrico Heitzer to provide a brief overview of the book and its main themes. Dr. Heitzer.
Thank you for having the floor. Emerging from a conference in January 2017, our volume raises critical questions about the aftermath of National Socialism. With regard to the GDR, there is sporadic research on this, but not to the extent and depth that would be desirable. Research, but also journalism, schools, museums, and memorial sites must catch up on what didn't happen in the GDR. Behind this is not only the recognition of the connection between insufficiently coming to terms with the history of National Socialist past in the GDR and the current right-wing tendencies within. A climate has emerged in which previously ignored or suppressed lines of conflict in German majority society, such as dealing with right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism, and racism, are clearly emerging. Again and again, attempts to come to terms with the GDR history were even instrumentalized for right-wing populist engagement. An intervention in the sense of a critical, historical, political, educational work is the main concern of our volume. It took a long time in the old Federal Republic of Germany before contemporary historical research, but also political education, museum and memorial politics or historical teaching began to ask critical questions. Debates about National Socialism and its aftermath in post-National Socialist societies, however, existed from the very beginning, but only gradually, oh my gosh, questions were discussed, such as how many people participated in the crimes, how successful denazification was. It's a very actual topic. How comprehensive compensation for National Socialist injustice was, or whether all groups of victims actually received recognition. Our plea for a new look at the GDR refers to various existing suggestions. I would like to mention Jeffrey Herf, whose book Divided Memory on the different dealings with the Shoah in the Federal Republic and the GDR has remained unmatched. Lastly, the work Fremde und Fremdsein in der DDR, Strangers and Being Strangers in the GDR by, among others, Patrice Poutrus, who's with us. In the context of the massive racist riots that followed the demise of the GDR and continued through the 1990s, the book ventured the argument that it was questionable, and this is a quote, I quote, whether the racist, nationalist and anti-Bolshevist stereotypes of Nazi propaganda, which were undoubtedly widespread among the population, were actually eradicated from the population's canon of values simply by the prayer mill-like repetition of the GDR's founding anti-fascist myth, end of quote. None of this has yet initiated a paradigm shift in GDR research. With the rise of right-wing political movements such as Pegida, or Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, AfD party. However, it may be more obvious today when it was 20 years or 25 years ago that the political system and the society of the GDR can no more longer be detached from the context of historical National Socialism and contemporary right-wing radicalism that can be the old and new federal republic. The first part of the volume is devoted to topics such as anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the GDR, the treatment of Sinti and Roma, so-called asociality, and opposition to the system. We do not claim to comprehensively describe the blind spots of research as well as the consequences of National Socialism up to the present. We are merely elements of a debate about the GDR and part of a plea for a different view. The vanishing point is not the end of the Cold War and the unification of the two German states, but the so-called Third Reich and its unprecedented crimes. The history, structure, and ideology of the SED dictatorship have been part of common post-war history since 1989. The legacy of the GDR as a post-National Socialist society in its various forms has so far often played only an indistinct role in United Germany, whether in live world contexts, in historical research, or in memorial political debates. Its investigation and evaluation are part of critical self-assurance. The volume is intended to stimulate a stronger positioning of the GDR in the broad lines of a 20th century history and can only be understood as an impetus to be followed by further research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this overview. You gave us a good sense of the book's main thrust and its various themes. And what's probably clear right away is that the book, or I should explain, the book is not a volume with research articles that claim to know the answers to many questions that you are raising, but your volume is filled with short pieces, almost position papers that are meant as conversation starters, right? And not the end of the conversation. And from my side, I first want to congratulate you on getting this important volume out in English and thus allowing those of us teaching in the Anglophone world to draw on your work. And as somebody who publishes in German and English as well, I am keenly aware of the efforts that it takes to get work translated. So I really want to recognize your team of translators, if I may, Miriam Fields, Alan Johnson, Martina Jones, Anthony Hood, Marianne Kober, and Daniela Bly for their excellent and dedicated work. Historians have pursued the history of the GDR for more than 3 decades now, and this effort has gone through several phases. In the early 1990s, scholarship was intent on explaining the unforeseen collapse of the GDR, and for good or ill, we saw a return of the totalitarianism paradigm and witnessed the debate of what kind of dictatorship the GDR was. And then there was a shift to the history of everyday life and Eigensinn that opened the path to more socially and culturally informed histories of the GDR, and also a more nuanced debate on the governance of the GDR developed over time. And we have arrived at a point where we increasingly consider the GDR neither on its own terms nor in exclusive relationship to its West German nemesis, but in a global context, as in recent books of Ned Richardson-Little on human rights, Julie Alt on the environment, and Christina Schwenkel on East German architecture in Vietnam, just to mention a few very recent titles. And your edited volume After Auschwitz makes the effort to situate the GDR within the major flows of the 20th century, as you put it, but of equal importance, you collectively make the case that the GDR needs to be understood as a post-dictatorial society, right? As one of the three successor societies to National Socialism, the other two obviously being West Germany and Austria. The SED regime postulated a sharp break with this past. It proclaimed to be the answer to National Socialism, a radical departure from fascism and a new hopeful future. And this official anti-fascism of the GDR was its main source of legitimacy. Christoph Classen, in his contribution in your volume, succinctly summarizes the function of this official anti-fascism, quote, a promise of salvation in the form of mastering the past for the sake of a brighter socialist future. So your book puts legacies at the center of inquiry. First, you ask about the legacies of the Nazi dictatorship for the GDR, and then you ask about the legacies of the GDR's anti-fascism and ritualized engagement with Nazism for unified Germany, right? So you're hopping across these two caesuras with your questions. So you read the GDR's history not from its collapse backwards, but from the end of Nazism forward. And you ask, what was the price of this anti-fascism and for whom, right? Which blind spots did the postulated break with the Nazi past create? And as Dr. Heitzer just mentioned, Jeffrey Herf has done path-breaking work along these very lines in his book, Divided Memory, that came out in 1997. And he is represented in your volume with not one, but two contributions. And still, my first question for you is, why do you think the perspectives that you suggest in your book have been neglected for the past 3 decades? I don't know who wants to pick this up, but the floor is open.
Maybe I start. I hope you can all hear me now. I think history writing is always a mirror of what the Germans call Zeitgeist. And since the unification of the two German states, Zeitgeist says, we do not want to discuss any longer about the Shoah and its consequences. We want to see Germans as victims of two dictatorships. And not all the authors in our volume follow the same arguments and follow the same view, but we all agree that GDR can't be isolated out of the context of National Socialism and the Shoah. We all see that there is 3 states that have to discuss in this manner. This is the former Federal Republic of Germany. This is the former GDR, who does not exist any longer today. And this is Austria. But they were not discussed in that way. Just have a look, for example, at the many projects of the Stiftung Aufarbeitung in Germany, which is a follow-up of the 2 commissions of the German Bundestag, which worked from, I think, 1992 to 1998. If you look at the publications, for example, of the German Bundestag, of these commissions who dealt with the history of the GDR, issues like, what happened to the Nazis in the GDR? How many Nazis were punished in the GDR? What happened to solidarity with Israel in the GDR? And other issues that are connected to this theme, they do not occur. They simply do not exist if you look at these publications. There are now some, but this is not the main focus of GDR research today. And I think, as I started, that has to do with a shift of what we could call zeitgeist. Many people, and historians too, have enough of discussing the Shoah and its consequences for German politics.
Thank you. Anetta Kahane.
May I just add something? I think it's interesting because the view on the GDR was a very Western view on what happened in East, and so the Western world saw all this Eastern bloc falling apart and within the GDR. And so it was described as a post-communist era, post-communist society with all the transformational society. And the GDR was just like something in between everything, but it was not seen as part of the history of Germany. And the moment when the GDR disappeared everything. The thinking about the transformational society, but also about the post-communist society. And we thought that the GDR is not just a piece of land where the GDR landed one day in 1945 or 1949 and disappeared in 1990 when it was reunificated with Western Germany. But it was part of an entire country that was just the same as in West. So it had an impact that in East Germany, there were the same Germans, like in West Germany, they were the same amount of perpetrators, of people who were standbyers. It was just the same society, but nobody was talking about this. They were all focused on the GDR as a communist experiment or as something that came from somewhere and disappeared. And what we thought is that you cannot understand really what is happening now in East Germany and in Germany as a whole if you don't understand East Germany and the history of East Germany from the beginning. So it was a reaction on World War II, and it was also a reaction on everything that happens, including the Shoah. But now there was an agreement not to discuss this in the GDR. So the agreement was there was a little group of around about 200,000 anti-fascists who were really resistant fighters, people who were in concentration camps or in the Soviet Union or immigrated. And when they came back, they decided we want to build up an anti-fascist country. But they built it up with 60 million people and not with only 200,000. So there was built an infrastructure of self-understanding that it was anti-fascist, and the population said, okay, we are anti-fascists, we have enough from the war. We will not discuss this as long as you don't bother us with all the Shoah stuff and the Jews and the terrible things, as long as you consider that the working class people were also victim of the Nazis. We agree. But inside the GDR, it was still the same. The educational style, the talks on the table, on the dinner table, everything was just the same. It was the same people with the same stories, with the same memories on the war and whatever happened. And we thought that we should look at this to understand why the GDR was what it was and why there was so many right-wing extremism in the moment when the GDR disappeared. Because this is, I think it is related to the fact that that National Socialism was never an issue in the real life of people. And I think, answering your question, I think that the Federal Republic after unification was not very interested in starting over again, this discussion about guilt and about the war and about the Jews and everything. They said, okay, you had your anti-fascism, and so you don't have to deal with that anymore. Just look at, excuse my English, just have a look. Let us have a look at the post-communist thing and the communism and the extremism and the idea that the National Socialism is as evil as the communism and other forms of switching away from the responsibility for what happened in World War II by the Germans.
Thank you. So clearly the focus lies on societal and cultural continuities across the 45 caesura. That's what you want to draw attention to. And you also just defined in a way your vanishing point, right? The explanandum, what needs explaining. And that is a wave of right-wing violence in unified Germany in the 90s. So we really get this whole trajectory in your comment. I nonetheless want to point out a little look at the West German historiography about the Nazi past. I cannot overlook the fact that in the 1990s, we are in fact getting the main studies on West Germany as a post-dictatorial society, right? The books that are coming out in the 90s, Norbert Frey's Politics of the Past, Ulrich Herbert's best biography, Ulrich Herbert's very important edited collection, Wandlungsprozesse in Westdeutschland, Transformation Processes in West Germany, exactly about a change of attitude, a liberalization of attitudes. That's his famous liberalization thesis, by now, of course, also revised. But still, the 1990s in West German historiography is the moment that gives us the publications on West Germany as a post-dictatorial society, running parallel to the first wave of Aufarbeiting the East German past. You also just succinctly...
Yeah, and maybe I enter. That is the reason why it is so astonishing that in case of GDR, that does not come up in the same way. That's so interesting. These two processes walk parallel, so to say. There is a historiography who starts to discuss how was the BND created, how was the police created, the military, and so on and so on. But they do not discuss it in case of the GDR. They just discuss it as a communist, socialist, anti-capitalist society, and do not look at the same facts where they look in the same time in the way at the Western side. This is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's fine. It almost seems that a lot of debris of Cold War propaganda first had to be removed to get to the point to discuss the GDR in those terms as well. Yeah, and Dr. Kahane had just succinctly summarized actually the anti-fascist myth of the GDR, and that moves me to my my next question. The last book that engaged East Germany's official anti-fascism and that attracted attention here in the United States was Susan Neyman's Learning from the Germans, which came out in 2019. And it came out with a trade press, which means it was from the beginning geared to reach a broader audience, was widely reviewed outside of academic venues, and making it possible for Neyman to share her core ideas also in venues like the New Yorker, the New York Times. So she has really established herself here as a go-to person. Now, her view of East German anti-fascism is simply incompatible with the one that you advance in your book. She argues that East Germany did a better job of working through the Nazi past than West Germany. Her plea is to take GDR anti-fascism seriously, to take it by its word, and to recognize that it was more progressive than West German engagements with the Nazi past. So she points out that more people were put on trial in the GDR than in the FRG, and that there were more former Nazis in office in West Germany than in the GDR. And she really is concerned that there might be a near complete amnesia about East Germany's anti-fascist past, right? That East Germany's anti-fascism may be forgotten. And again, since this book has received attention here in the United States with American readers, it is also used in teaching. So I wanted to invite you to explain in which ways your book advances a different view. Who would like to take this on? Patrice, do you want to go?
Yeah, that's kind of complicated because on the one hand, this view repeats the self-description of the East German dictatorship. I would love to argue about the subject of trials on Nazis. I'm willing to believe that probably more Nazis were arrested or executed in the East. But I'm not so sure about the questions how many people were brought on trial and on what kind of trials that were, to make a point on, I think, certain differences. The other thing is to what kind of inner societal narrative led the anti-fascist myth in the GDR. Let it open it the debate about the general values of human rights, or open it the debate on how important it is not just to ask who was against the Nazi regime, or was it was it just to prevent, to discuss the very serious and important questions, how the population of the Soviet occupied zone and later GDR were involved in the system of National Socialism. And that never happened. That's what we argue. That the great agreement was, and which attracted a lot of people, was if you stand still in the system and cooperate with the Communist Party, then all your guilt will be forgotten and forgiven. You get in trouble with the system, then we will remind you on that, which worked very well for a lot of people. Only a few, and interesting enough, a lot of real anti-fascists opposed that thing in the early years of the GDR. And there's another thing.
The connection.
What we wanted to. My connection is bad.
Your connection is slightly unstable. Yes.
Still.
Yes, it is.
I can't do it. Can't change it because I'm here from a hotel room.
Yes. Right.
The point I wanted to make, the long process in public debates and in historical research on individual, personal relation to the Nazi regime and how that affected the society later on, never occurred, and almost never. Don't be too absolute. Almost never occurred. It was only a few with that idea that it would be important to discuss it. And there is a point that for a very long time seemed to be very charming for West Germany, the Germans to describe the GDR.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Right.
Which was very charming for West Germans, was the idea that in the East German society there was a a room of privacy for almost everyone, in which the East Germans remained are we really are. And our point was, and that is the most interesting parts of all, to ask what happened in these untouched territories of a society which claimed to be an anti-fascist society.
Right, and you probably, this encapsulates, of course, a major challenge for the historian, how to access these more private spaces, right? How can we capture the continuity of attitudes, of values in these private or familial conversations? Yeah, so we were still on the question of Susan Neimann's book, Learning from the Germans, that advances a different reading of East Germany's anti-fascism. And Anetta Kahane wants to contribute to this question as well, please.
Yes, this was the history of my life, anti-fascism, because I'm coming from an anti-fascist family. I'm not a historian, so I can just describe this in my own way. What I was suffering really hard, badly, was that there was an official anti-fascism, and there was this pressure from my parents to tell me we have been to the concentration camp and civil war in Spain, and so for you to have a better future and for you to not to argue with the GDR. But in a society where authoritarianism and dictatorship is ruling, you cannot combat prejudice, anti-Semitism, or anything else. You cannot do that because this is an illusion. You have to have the argument. You have to have the freedom of speech. You have to have all these forms of struggle, you know, to have the controversial discussion and everything to come over. There is no shortcut to come over of this ugly history. So, and this is what the anti-fascism tried to do. They tried to take a shortcut. They say, well, we declare anti-fascism and please stop discussion about it. And my favorite sentence is, the opposite of fascism is not anti-fascism. The opposite of fascism is a democratic culture. You cannot do that without that. So the entire concept of the book of Susan Neiman is like coming back to this old history of we did good in the way we did because we prohibited Nazism to exist. We changed everybody from this, we changed all these big Nazis. They went to the West, or we sent them to jail or something. Now we have the new people, and with the new people we have the better future. But they were reproducing this authoritarian system, this authoritarian thinking, this authoritarian behavior, and authoritarianism is one of the main sources of anti-Semitism, as Adorno said, and everybody knows. And so you cannot overcome this with an authoritarian approach to a society that has to overcome this kind of cruel past. And I don't understand how somebody who grew up in a democratic society can really believe that the creation of a new human, what was a propaganda idea of the socialists, especially of Stalin, to create a new human being, a socialist human being of integrity and morality and a sense of his position in the class struggle. I cannot believe that somebody is still believing in this. And this is, for me, it is just something that is very painful to get back to this idea. And as something else I want to say is that the universalism, to make the victims, to universalize all victims, you know, to say there were not only the Jews, but also, I don't know, the Sorbs and the Sinti and Roma and the other people and the Polish people and the Soviet people. And in the end, also the poor German working class people who had an idea and could not resist to what Hitler's mind was. You know, they blow up his mind, and then all these poor working class people were following him. They were also victims, and the war was terrible, and everybody was a victim. So if you universalize victimhood in this way, and you see and you put it from this concept to the United States, like she said, well, we have to see all the victims. Then she should say in the United States, all life matters. And she cannot do that in the United States because everybody will be crying out, of course, because this is something that people say if they want to feel, if they don't want to have any responsibility, you know. And when you say Black Lives Matters, because there is something to really fight against, like racism. You have to say also Jewish life matters when it comes to the Shoah and anti-Semitism, and not to say this is just something that is not so important. It is as important as everything, what it is, you know. And this was just a little remark on the book, but I think that the main point on anti-fascism is that it is not leading to real anti-fascism. It is conserving in a certain way the attitudes of authoritarian family structure and what Patrice said, the privacy, and that there everything remained just as it was. It is a perfect conservation of it's a time capsule, to put it through the time, and in the end of the GDR it came up and what is this? Yeah, and that's why we made the book, to see what was how the feeling of being part of the post-National Socialist society is part of what is East Germany today and what it did to entire Germany after unification. And yeah, I think this is very, very important to see that also the GDR was part of this Germany.
Of this overall trajectory, absolutely, yes. Patrice.
I just want to add a few. As you said, it is very hard to work out such a approach, and it is also a methodological problem. But the questions were raised very early on in the debate about the GDR. In the early 1990s, some very smart historians said, as far as we know, the political government is not able to create its own society. So the question back to the GDR was, what kind of society exists under the rule of the Communist Party? Which elements cooperate or collaborate with the communist dictatorship, which parts were just bystanders, who resisted, and the most important question, and why, and how, which means you have to take a very close look to social developments, to social relations under the dictatorship, it is not enough to say it is a communist dictatorship by explaining how this worked out for such a long time. But that actually was the approach from where I came from, which in the beginning didn't have the idea of arguing about the past, of the Nazi past, just raising the question, what kind of society is it that worked so well with the communist dictatorship for such a long time, and why and how? So to argue that open brought some social historians in a lot of trouble, as the time was, as Martin described it, because it was away from the constructing a new totalitarian consensus in history, and also away from defending the GDR or the experiment. I never thought it was an experiment. Even when I was a member of the Communist Party, I never thought it was an experiment. I always thought they took it seriously. We had a plan and try to implement it, and the real serious question was how were the conditions under which we implemented that, and what really changed, and what was taken from the past of that society.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Jander.
Maybe we have to add another thing. What Susanne Neiman does not do is a critical read of what is meant by anti-fascism. She cannot see that the theory of fascism can be used as a source of exculpation of the German workers and the Germans. And it was read in that way by many people who lived that way in the GDR. The fascism theory more or less says that fascism is nothing more than a radicalized capitalism, and the main victim of this system is the working class, which is exploited. And that more or less was the scheme how historians in the GDR and speakers from the SED were explaining fascism. And that in that way, that was a sort of exculpation of for all the perpetrators who had cooperated with the Nazis, who became part of the Shoah and the other mass murders from the Nazis in that time. And I would say this is a big difference between our book and the book of Susan Neiman. She is not able to read, as I would say, this anti-fascism as a form of a theory of exculpation of the Germans. And that was visible for many GDR citizens all the day. Remember, for example, the big memorial unter den Linden for the victims of fascism. Part of this memorial has been ashes from died German soldiers somewhere at the Eastern Front. They were seen in that memorial as a part of the victims of fascism. This was at the central place of Unter den Linden, so very clearly visible. So I think that is a very important difference between Susan Neiman books and ours, that we stirred, some authors of our books stirred, to read fascism theory and anti-fascism critically and start to think, how was that present in everyday life in East Germany? I think that is a very important, way of discussing GDR society too, besides all the things that Anetta and Patrice told us.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would like to move us on to Dr. Heitzer's contribution to the volume. Dr. Heitzer, your contribution highlights opposition against SED rule from groups that professed ongoing support for the Nazi regime in the late 40s and 50s. So such groups tried to challenge the budding SED regime, the early SED regime, through violence if necessary. You were talking about the 1947 bomb attack on an SED party office in Bernburg. And you argue that research on right-wing opposition against the GDR is still underdeveloped. For now, your examples come from the late 40s and early 1950s. So how do you see the trajectory of right-wing opposition develop in later decades? What do we need to look for? Where do we need to look? Is there even an inter-German dimension to these right-wing oppositional groups in the GDR?
Thank you for this very good question. First, I understand my contribution as an impulse because I see a blind spot when looking at the GDR opposition. The fact that especially in the early period, obviously, many of them had not and could not detach themselves from their pre-1945 socialization seems trivial to me at first. But while working on my dissertation, this was one of my experiences, I wanted to publicly discuss the Nazi background of some people who were in the resistance against the GDR. Let's say, for instance, in the context of the Kampfgruppe gegen Unmenschlichkeit, fighting group against inhumanity, one of the bigger groups resisting in the 40s and 50s from West Germany against the regime in East Germany. I met with a lot of resistance. Moreover, I noticed that in practically all studies on the subject of opposition and resistance, especially in the first years after National Socialism, people's biographies did not begin until 1945. I think we see here an unreflected continuation of the constellation of the Cold War, according to which at times in the Federal Republic or nearly every anti-communist was more or less automatically considered a good Democrat, even if the anti-communism clearly still contained elements of National Socialist anti-Bolshevism, or the anti-communist was even anti-democrat. This was part of a social agreement that favored the reintegration of Nazi-incriminated people who were when to be found in large numbers in the Secret Service, police, and order administration. We all know that. I have focused on the 40s and 50s for several reasons. First, this is a period that I have researched most intensively myself, of course. Second, the phenomenon of a recognizable connection to the pre-1945 socialization that I have focused on seems to have become less important during the GDR period, which is not to say that it disappeared. However, other aspects which are discussed in other essays played a role, which has to do with insufficient critical reappraisal of the National Socialist and the transmission of problematic attitudes and values. But this is more difficult to explore, and my essay is, after all, a plea for appropriate research. And I want to remember my essay is now 5 years old, and in the meantime several things happened, but I want to dig in one point deeper from your questions. Although there are said to have been 15,000 people who shared right-wing extremist views in the final days of the GDR, as I also refer to in my article, it was not possible to form a cohesive national opposition or something like that in heavily monitored society like the GDR was in its final days. Here, as with right-wing extremism in the old federal Republic, much research remains to be done. And I want just to mention one example. An integrated history of German right-wing extremism is lacking, which is, after all, also a post-Nazi right-wing extremism, which brings us back to the perspective our volume advocates. The radical right-wing scenes in East and West communicated with each other in many ways. They were profiteers of German unity. Completely unexplored, for example, is the fact that the number of right-wing terrorists or leading figures in the Western German right-wing extremist scene of the 70s and 80s consisted of former GDR residents who came to the West by escape or ransom, Häftlingsfreikauf. Just one example, terrorists such as Uwe Behrendt, who shot Shlomo Levin and his partner in Erlangen 1980, or leading members of the Wehrsportgruppe Hoffmann. Karl-Heinz Hoffmann grew up in Thuringia, where I come from, and several others came from the GDR. So I think this is an unexplored very field, and there's a lot of research to do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I do not take further convincing, really. I mean, it is quite blatant that we have a major lacuna there. And I mean, your work is on the late 40s and early 50s, and then really by around 1980, the GDR really has developed its own neo-Nazi scene that is a new quality from what you have examined in your essay. The West German journalist Peter Wenzierski reported on this neo-Nazi scene for the news show Kontraste in 1988 for the first time. I'm also thinking about the trajectories of radicalization for East German neo-Nazis. The prime example, of course, is Ingo Hasselbach, right, from Berlin-Weißensee, who radicalized in GDR prison because he was locked up with unreconstructed former SS officers, right, who educated him, quotation marks, right? And he became a major figure in the extreme right after 1990 and then staged his well-publicized exit. So how should we approach the study of neo-Nazism in the GDR for those later decades? You have already pointed to this inter-German dimension, but how shall we go about doing this? How seriously do we need to take this phenomenon of these 15,000 people in the final days of the GDR?
I think we cannot overestimate it, because 15,000 mostly young people are a big amount of persons who were openly saying or claiming that they shared right-wing extremists. And this was under the surface of a dictatorship society. And after this society ended and the repression broke, this potential somehow released and profited from the unification and the possibilities which came. And I really don't know what work has to be done in detail, but I think there's a lot of research to do for this final days, especially for the final days in East Germany, in the GDR. And I already know that at the moment there are some projects doing this kind of research, and I'm really curious about the results of this, and I hope that our volume started or inspired some of this research.
Yes, and the connection to the official anti-fascism is, of course, evident as well, right? Because it was not supposed to exist; it was declared not to exist, right?
Yeah.
I saw two hands. Anetta Kahane, please.
Yes, thank you. I lived in, I think Patrice as well, we lived in this situation in the 80s where everywhere were Nazis. And this was the moment when well, what it was obvious that the anti-fascism is completely lost. That makes no sense. There was no possibility for the state to react. This was just homemade, you know, because it was the result of all this development. After 1989, or in the last days of the GDR, I remember very well. The first thing we did, I was the ombudsperson in Berlin for immigrants at that time. And the problem of the neo-Nazis was not about 15,000 people. It was about 1/3 of the population. And this were all the researches we did with our low instruments. You know, we couldn't really do research. We asked everybody to do research on prejudice, on racism, on right-wing extremism, but nobody was interested. It only started in the late 90s that the science was kind of interested in this field. In the early 90s, it was for us a shock to see that these 15,000 people we are talking about were dominating the atmosphere and entire landscapes. You know, they were just like we were talking about no-go areas, and so it was really a big threat to everybody who was opposing Nazis or were looking different or whatever. So it was 30% of the population. They didn't have the Nazi outfit, but the Nazis were like the fish in the water. You know, it was just they were just one hard expression of what was going on in the 90s in East Germany. And I was very shocked at that moment, at that time, that nobody was really interested. And whenever we came up, I remember in the late 90s, where the first Green and Social Democrat government came in power, I went to Bonn to talk to the politicians there of the Green Party, and I explained them what the situation was, and they didn't believe me. They say, "Oh no, this is not possible." Yeah, I mean, then if this would be so, we would have a problem. Oh, we cannot have this problem. We have so many problems. We cannot deal with that. It was into my face, you know. And I said, but what if it is true? Oh, well, no idea. So only after 2001, the government started to develop programs against right-wing extremism, developing the civil society and empowering people to do something against it. And at that time, it was also in the science, like something that came up as, that would be nice, that would be interesting. And the ignorance from the West and the East, of course, in this field was really scaring. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Patrice surely can tell more about that.
Yeah, I wanted to move to Patrice anyway with the next question. Do you first want to contribute to this issue, Patrice, or?
Yeah, no, just go ahead. I think we will get to the point again.
Yeah, we are circling around similar issues throughout the conversation. Yeah. Patrice, together with Jan C. Behrens and Dennis Cook, you were among the first to address the history of xenophobia in the GDR. Your starting point was very presentist, right? You tried to explain the hatred and violence against non-Germans in the early 1990s during the so-called baseball bat years, as journalist Christian Bangel called them. But you didn't find answers in the transformation years of the 1990s themselves, but you had to dig deeper into the particular social conditions of the GDR that, as you argued, prevented the development of a culture of tolerance. And in your contribution, you used the terms strangers, Fremde, and xenophobia, Fremdenfeindlichkeit. And I really want to know, especially coming out of an American scholarly context, I really want to know, is there a reason that you're not using the term racism as a category of analysis?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very important question that in certain ways describes my, just to make it easy, I wouldn't use that word these words anymore. But there were, I would call it racism in a not just in the sense of prejudice and violence, but also, and even more important, and that's why what we talk about social and cultural basis on prejudice and violence. But at that point, it gets difficult because 20 years ago, we hadn't the term intersectional relation, which means we use the term being strange, which is different from xenophobic, because from our earlier research, which was a social and cultural history approach, we learned that to be excluded from the general society in East Germany, or better to say in the GDR, because the GDR or the SED incorporates always the political system, and the term East German seemed to neutralize exactly that, the political or the governing dimension of the process. So we saw our work not as an alternative to the question, what kind of political system was it? We saw our work as as something that explains how it works. And in the East German society, where in that context I still try to use that geographical term, but there were not only foreigners were outsiders or strangers in that sort. So, for instance, people who did not fit into the overall idea of a working society, which could be elderly people, single mothers, gay people, people with other disabilities, have serious problems to become a part of the GDR society. And that exploration led us to the question, is that something new? Is that something, or can we learn from ideas about the good society, which was much older? Our statement, it is not enough just to look at to the Nazi past by just blaming it. The Nazi past of the GDR incorporate the GDR again into the German history of modern society, and which parts of society were excluded and which were included. And we were very hesitant to use the term racism, because in the German discourse that always leads to a very big defense wall that racists are other societies. That happens in the United States. maybe in South Africa or somewhere, but here in Germany, we have other problems. And it took a while us to say we don't care anymore about these reactions. We think it has a lot to do with racism. If you think about racism not just as I said, not just as a matter of violence, but also as a worldview, as something you look at and which explains the world to certain persons and makes sense to legitimize their doings, but also their position in the society. That was a long way to go, and it's even in social science in Germany, it is still a big fight to use that approach. So I hope that answers your question. But behind that was also a methodological approach to how to connect certain effects of an authoritarian and dictatorial governed society with each other, not to isolate that phenomenon again from other developments in the East German society.
Yes, thank you. I mean, and here in the US, people like Rita Chin have pointed out the difficulty of using the term Rassismus und Rasse in German academic discourse in a way that is possible in English. There's really also something that goes on here.
But I'm still opposed to the use of the word race, because that's a different debate. But what I wanted to say is that beforehand is that the use of anti-fascism was very similar to the use of the colorblind society in the United States. Not to see the differences, not to see the fault lines and the conflicts which are still there if you label a society such as. And I think that is still a big problem here in Germany to say that racism is just a phenomenon on the edge of the society and not in the center of the society. And we had a lot of trouble to argue that racist practices are not just a reaction to a certain social status or to a certain social crisis, that it is exactly the other way around. If you are in a social conflict, then you use racism as a source of legitimizing your position or your actions. So you need to be a racist beforehand to act racist in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and following up on what you said, I just want to point out that there are chapters in this book on the stigma of asociality in the GDR, another chapter on lesbians and gays in the GDR, and one on anti-Gypsyism in the GDR. So your volume is speaking to these marginalized social groups as well. I am monitoring the chat. I invite people who are on the live stream to put their questions into the chat. There's nothing right now, so I move on with a question for Dr. Jander. Dr. Jander, your essay reminds readers of the People's Chamber Declaration of April 12, 1990. So the first really elected parliament of the still existing GDR asked Jews worldwide for forgiveness. It asked the people of Israel for forgiveness for the GDR's hostility towards the state of Israel. However, your essay also points out that none of the civil rights groups of the Wende era found much to say on the Nazi past and the Holocaust. It's not that research on the Holocaust was forbidden in the GDR, and yet the official anti-fascist memorial culture marginalized, even erased Jews as the primary victims of Nazism. And those who tried to argue otherwise, like Helmut Eschwege, found themselves marginalized as well. And Helmut Eschwege is already mentioned in the introduction of your volume and holds a special place. So could you give us a sense of Helmut Eschwege's relevance for your volume?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I'm a big fan of Helmut Eschwege, so thank you very much for this question. I found him very late after the GDR had ended. I did not know about him when the GDR existed. And in my eyes, as a history student of West Berlin, the most big opponents to GDR were guys like Wolf Biermann, Robert Havemann, and others. The interesting thing with their idea of anti-fascism is that it is more or less very similar to the anti-fascism of the GDR leaders themselves. It has some conflicts and differences, but it has a lot of same issues and themes as the official anti-fascism. And when I grew up in West Germany, West Berlin, I always asked, hasn't there not been any other person, any other group of people who were discussing Nazism, fascism in a different way than the SED did it? And Helmut Eschwege is that person. Maybe he is the one and only guy who could be called the Holocaust researcher in the GDR, because he did all his life exactly this thing. He was born in Hanover. He managed to get out to the Mandate Palestine with his mother and two siblings. In 1938, his father had died in 1936. And after the end of the Second World War and the Shoah, he decided to return because he believed that communism would be he decided to go to the GDR, Sowjetische Besatzungszone, because he believed that the communists would be those who could deal best with fascism and with these things. All his friends in Israel, they laughed when he told them he wanted to go back. They said, "Are you curious?" But he said, "No, the communists will do it." And 1952, he was attacked as a Zionist because he was a fan of Israel. And he lost his job at the Deutsches Historisches Museum and started and decided to become a historian. He decided to explain to his communist comrades what anti-Semitism has been, what the Shoah has been, and so on. He wrote a lot of books. Most of them were not published. Some of them were published, but in a very reduced way. But he did not give up. He tried it a first time, a second time, a fourth and a fifth time, and he never gave up, because let's say the idea of his entire life was, I have to explain to my communist comrades what anti-Semitism really is, what Jews really are, and what happened during the Holocaust. He did not use that word, but he described it in that sense. So this is a real breakthrough in the entire language of this communist anti-fascist world, which we can see in his books that were censored all the way. But he became an important name in the Holocaust research world. researchers from the United States, from Great Britain, from all over the world. They were writing letters to Mr. Eschwege, please help us in this question, that question, in which archive do I find this and that? So he became famous all over the world, but not in the GDR. Sometimes he even had to work as a, how do you call, in Germany, they're called Hausmeister at the Dresden University, and other jobs like this. Yeah, I think that this history, this man, his publications are important, let's say, in especially three ways. First of all, there was a man who was able to write about Jewish history and about the Shoah in the GDR. First question, why did he stay an exception? This is really a interesting point. Why have there not been more researchers, people who did that job like he did? If we can understand, if we can answer that question, we can answer the question why became this fascist theory the most important theory for the legitimation of the GDR, because there were no other people who destroyed that sort of history writing, how Mr. Eschwege did it. The second thing why I think he is so important is, why did the leaders of the GDR destroy most of the works of Mr. Eschwege? What was so dangerous about these things he was saying? They could have acted in a totally different way. He could have been one of the most honored historians of the GDR, a man who had survived the Shoah, who had come back to the GDR. He could have become, let's say, the symbol of the anti-fascist new Germany, but well, he had to work as a Hausmeister at the Dresden University. So if we can answer that question, what did they think was so dangerous about him? I think we learn about the character of the GDR. And the third point is, he was not only a historian who wrote about anti-Semitism and the Shoah and all these things. He was a man who defended the legitimacy of Israel, of the foundation of Israel. And he did not hesitate to say this everywhere. He did not sign letters to denounce Israel during the Six-Day War and all that stuff. He refused to do so, and he explained why he refused and other things. That is the third point. What was so dangerous for the communists in GDR that they were not able to allow this person to explain his solidarity with Israel? And if we have answers to all these three questions, why was there not many other historians who did research like Helmut Eschwege? Secondly, what was so dangerous for the ruling communists to accept this historian as a wonderful guy who could have represented the GDR? And thirdly, what was so dangerous with the idea of a legitimate Israel state? So all these questions, I think, lead into that. What was the society of the GDR, and what was the structure of this communist regime? In the end, it was one of the three German post-Holocaust states, which on the one hand did not only drive out the biggest part of the Jewish population, which was living in the GDR in 1945 to 1949, in this purges in 1952, 1953. And in the end, it became a state who even backed the armed struggle against Israel. They delivered weapons to Arab states who were fighting Israel. They hosted the PLO, who was fighting Israel too. So he's an interesting figure. And when we are able to explain his story, I think we can explain a big part of the history of the society of the GDR.
And I cannot help to notice that Joseph Wolf is very much the parallel figure in West Germany,
Yes.
right? Also an outsider, not accepted by the West German
Yes.
profession, and yet doing this absolutely important documentary work.
Yes.
With kind of late implications once it was realized, once its importance was being realized. Yeah. Right. Okay. Let us move into our exit loop. With your book, you have issued a plea for a paradigm shift, for new perspectives on the GDR, and your volume really indicates that a collective search or grappling is underway that reveals dissatisfaction with the established narratives, but has perhaps not yet arrived at a synthesis in its own right. So we are kind of still in motion, we are still moving. To wrap up, I want to give each panelist the chance for a brief concluding statement. Do you have concrete plans to pursue elements of the research agenda that you are mapping out in your volume? What are your hopes for future scholarship on the legacies of the Nazi era for the GDR and the legacies of East German anti-fascism for unified Germany? How do we need to approach this topic now that Russia has attacked Ukraine and uses a lot of, as I said earlier, sound bites to legitimize its aggression? So I don't know who would like to start. Perhaps Anetta Kahane, would you like to go first?
Well, there's a lot of important questions. When it comes to the Ukraine, I always have this association, like this idea. I remember exactly that in this very my English, dichotomisch, how do you say?
Dichotomous or binary.
Yeah. Okay. In this world where you have only the contrast, the bad, the good and the bad, and so everything was Nazi. What was not part of the socialist anti-fascist idea, and it was a method of power to say we are the anti-fascists and the others are potentially or real Nazis. And this is exactly the same what Russia is doing at this moment to the Ukraine. They say if you don't, it's not the socialist idea, it's just an authoritarian, moralic or oppressive idea to blame somebody to be a Nazi just to justify the own aggression. And this was a very important point also in the oppressional policy of the GDR government. If you are not anti-fascist, what are you then? Then you must be a fascist. And I would like to. I was thinking about going further to explain this over and over again to the German, but also to other people, what the problem of East Germany was because the problem in Eastern Europe is just is more or less the same. They also didn't worked with their past. So there is still something to do as well. But Eastern Germany was part of the Nazi regime in real, and I would like to have a closer look to this part of the world and to see what is in there, because it means something if you have democracy or if you don't have it. And I feel like democracy is very much in threat right now. And so we have to have a close look and to defend democracy by knowing what was happening there and what effects do this have to our future. This is what is interesting for me. And I think this is a very parallel thought about Ukraine and Russia as well.
Right. The power to name. Yeah, that is definitely at play. Who would like to go next with a closing statement?
Okay, I go on. Anetta Kahane and I, we already have done a prolongation of our book, this book. It's called Jews in the GDR, but we do not have do not have an English version of it so far. Just has been published in January of this year. Maybe we should think about an English version, but this is more about, a thing that I was talking about before with Helmut Eschwe again. We try to discuss the specific situation of a lot of Jews in the GDR who were leftists, sometimes even fans or members of the SED, but they were Jewish too. And these two things were fighting with each other. And we try to understand these conflicts. What has been the conflict for Jews living in the GDR? Why did they, as Anetta Kahane argues in one of the articles, why did they often go into the anti-fascism trap? This is why were they lost, so to say, between, on the one hand, thinking about the more or less fascist Federal Republic of Germany, or that was their idea of it, and on the other hand, knowing exactly that anti-Semitism was not that in GDR. They were caught in this conflict, and we try to describe in different biographies this story. I think this is an important way of discussing that form of anti-fascism that we had in GDR. And the second thing that I do is I will write a history of right-wing, left-wing, and Islamist terrorism in the Federal Republic of Germany and in GDR. I think anti-Semitism today has a lot of different faces, not only the left-wing face that we were discussing in GDR. It has the right-wing face too, as Enrico Heitzer says, and it has an Islamistic face too. And these three faces of anti-Semitism in the Federal Republic, they are a real big threat to our democracy. And they signal that the German society, who thinks itself it is a master of dealing with the past, has a lot of parts, a lot of areas in the society where the anti-Semitism is really existing and has power. The right-wing extremism and terrorism has big power now. It has really become a threat to a lot of people in Germany, to people that came to the Federal Republic later on, or to citizens, to Jews, to refugees and others. So I will discuss this phenomenon of these three new phases of anti-Semitism after the Second World War in Germany, and try to, well, do my best to push back this form of threat of democracy.
Yes, that sounds extremely promising. And so Dr. Heitzer, your statement, please.
Thank you. I would speak more from the perspective of memorial culture and historical political education work. The questions you raised are of significance for memorial sites and are important overall because of questions about the assessment and weighting of the historical periods of National Socialism and the GDR, or to put it short, communism in Germany, where were sometimes very massive disputes, in part arguments from the historians' dispute, the Historikerstreit of the 80s, were repeated during the last years, especially in the 1990s and 2000s. Demands were heard what sounded to some critics like the relativization of National Socialism and the Holocaust. For instance, Günter Morsch analyzes these contexts very well in his article in our book. I think that in this, or in the mirror of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, we will have this discussion anew. And we have to keep to be aware not to relativize National Socialism and the Holocaust. No, there are voices heard what say what now we can see what Russia is doing in Ukraine in the name of denazification. Parallels are sometimes drawn because there's, for example, an older discussion whether the well over 100,000 people who were imprisoned in so-called special camp by the Soviet occupation forces after 1945 were because of alleged Nazi involvement or as suspected opposition figures. This is a discussion we have here in the Sachsenhausen Memorial. So whether it was more a measure of denazification or more a measure of political repression. Andrew Beattie has recently, as he's an Australian historian, recently published a monograph on Allied internment in Germany after 1945 to 1949, 1950, what supports the first interpretation. But as I already said, now there are voices that say what we can see Russia is doing in Ukraine more or less the same in the name of denazification, and we have to be careful to use this to draw such parallels. There are also colleagues who claim that all opponents of the GDR system in the 40s and 50s aspire to parliamentary democracy. In my contribution to the volume, I try to sensitize people to the fact that for this reason alone, that it was in post-Nazi society, it is implausible and actually also ahistorical to retrospectively and tacitly ascribe democratic motives to all opponents of the system. In research on resistance to National Socialism, it has long been customary to present a broad spectrum of motives and also to speak critically about certain Nazi opponents. This differentiation has been predominantly missing in the appreciation of the resistance against the GDR. And so all these questions we discussed here will have an impact on exhibition and educational work, even though there are, as always, good examples. I will refer here to an exhibition by the Amadeu Antonio Foundation on neo-Nazi women in the GDR. We should hold on to this differentiation and work to ensure that it's not lost.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we are in the round of closing statements, and Patrice Poutrus is next.
Yeah, that's kind of strange for me to make a wordplay to be the last in that round. I think what's still needed is a history of the GDR. And not only in terms of science history, but this as well, but also in terms of reflecting on the conflicts about such a subject. What were the main ideas behind certain research approaches? What were the results? What happened in the Bundestags for almost 6 years? Why was GDR history part of of two parliamentary commissions? What impact had this on school books, on museums, on exhibitions, and not just to say this is right or this is wrong. No, to show the conflicts which were behind all of these developments and show the developments itself. The very idea that the memorial or the memory landscape right now was the same as it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago is totally wrong. But to help the people to understand why there was a shift on which conditions it was based and who were the opponents in these developments, that would be very interesting and helpful, not to be surprised any time again. Oh, I thought it was clear. I thought there's a final answer about such a thing. No, to say that even to research on such a subject is a process that never ended. Because of what Martin said in the beginning, it is a mirror of society. Research and representation of history and other non-societal, non-scientific environments. I personally was actually very fed up with the GDR at the beginning of the century. I really don't want to work anymore on that. But to get to the point, to the war on the Ukraine, the Russian attack on the Ukraine, I think it is even now, or it's now even more important to work on subject that said, what is behind that current conflict? What kind of history of social developments, on power shifts, and even on ideas, on good order, for instance, is behind such a conflict? We can make positions as citizens, but as researchers, we need to do the uncomfortable work to say what we see now is not really a surprise. It has its history, and we need to understand that to give explanations to the present. And that is actually still a moving work, a personal, a moving work. And sometimes I really, as I said about the GDR, I really can't stand it anymore. I think of a utopian a society where truth comes to everyone, reason is what connects each others. But obviously we are not at the end of history. The history is still conflicted and still, still a battleground.
Thank you. So a plea for an intellectual history of the historiography of the GDR, and an understanding that working through a certain past is not a linear process that cannot be reversed or lose traction. So I thank the panelists for this very engaged discussion. Allow me to show the book one more time. We discussed the book After Auschwitz, the Difficult Legacies of the GDR. And I also thank those who followed the conversation on the screen for their time that they shared with us. There were no questions in the chat that I could feed in here, but still we hope that you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to all panelists for being here today.